Enderal is a large-scale campaign and total conversion mod for Skyrim that includes tons of content, including a campaign, various quests, various gameplay additions, in a completely new world with an independent story and background. Now, I will be doing an analysis of this, but I also want to butt in and mention a few things that I've noticed. Some of them are comparisons, so it should be clear that there are some parts of this that are just my opinion where I'll probably elaborate on tangents. For a greater portion of the level makeup in Enderal, the architecture reflects those kinds of architectures that are visually inspired traditional medieval designs. This includes everything from the near ubiquitous and domineering image of the Western Cathedral to the street-aligned houses with timber frontage of old Europe. But it doesn't entirely reflect the historical layout of an old city in particular, and is instead largely composed of cramped enclosures of a mountainous fortress city, which offers the opportunity for variation in design. Compare the noble district to the foreign district, for instance, in terms of their topography. Now, I want to weigh in here to comment on something that I've been looking for, and Enderal is the only large-scale mod that has this, as far as I know. The only mod that has this, for that matter. I'm sure everyone remembers going to Whiterun and running into Nazim and getting the presumptuous,
"Do you get to the Cloud District very often?" Oh, what am I saying? Of course you don't.
"Well, yeah, it's 2 meters that way." Nobody in Whiterun is alone at night, because the town is so small that they probably invented instant messaging before everyone else in Skyrim. All you have to do is yell out your window to talk to, like, Jarl Balgruuf or something. So I'll go as far as to jump the gun and say that I would wager most Skyrim players wanted Bethesda to create larger holds. Not a single hold in Skyrim is convincing. They're basically all small towns, if that. And Bethesda might try to play this off and play the dummy and say, well, we didn't have time, or some excuse like that. I would bet players would be willing to sacrifice trivial and seldom touched caves for the sake of larger holds. So to eliminate the "we didn't have time" excuse or the overall size excuse, let's just think about something for a second. We have enough trivial and all but useless caves in Skyrim and other such dungeons and cells so that we can allot a handful to each hold. So let's do some basic math here. Let's say a set of useless and fully functional cells are allotted evenly to each hold. Each cell has some opportunity cost of time associated with it, which is the time expended for the creation of that cell. Take the total opportunity cost of all the allotted cells and distribute a portion of the opportunity cost evenly to each hold in Skyrim, so each hold has some cost of time. That amount of time in each hold could have been used to create more content in the holds that was used to create useless caves in the middle of nowhere that most players never stepped inside. And it tells you something about planning ahead. But this is a rabbit hole, so let's get back on topic. The point is, Enderal shows Bethesda up. Ark is the city that every hold should have been, or at least the holds that mattered or were the largest in the first place. There is a ton of content and the area that makes up the city. In this case, this Ark actually deserves to be called a city. If Nazim were in Ark, for example, he could actually pose the question more seriously, because there's an actual nobles district and not a lump of dirt 3 feet away called the Cloud District. So again, this is the standard for cities, or should be, as opposed to underperformance that results in the holds that we see in Skyrim. Now, someone might say, well, the holds are not supposed to be cities, which is kind of a weird argument simply on a lore level because they have been there for centuries and they have had plenty of time to develop. And by the way, some of those holds are actually larger in Elder Scrolls Online, which takes place in the Second Era. But anyway, I digress. With the medieval style architecture, there is a focus on simple, effective structure and an emphatic maintenance of conventionality. But with the more fantastical and mythology-inspired architecture of the dungeons, there is a stark contrast to counterbalance the emphasis on tradition, which is an elaboration of vanilla set pieces used in unorthodox and creative ways. There's also more originality in the layouts of the interiors of the latter kind for the most part. The exteriors of vanilla set pieces, like the Dwemer architecture set, are designed in the manner of a conventional layout, but the interiors stray away from that and tend to have a heavy emphasis on visual detail and the exploitation of visual techniques that distract the viewer from simplistic architecture and layouts. Such techniques are less persuasive in dungeons that are not involved in the main quest. Just go to any Dwemer-clad dungeon that wasn't involved in the main quest, and you'll notice that the layout is very conventional and feels like a different mapper made it, which may have been the case anyway. There are various areas that do their part in contributing and compensating for layouts that conform to the convention. At the same time, the designer or designers were bold enough in taking the risk at an attempt to design visually novel regions such as Silvergrove and succeed in adding architectural detail onto the lacking base buildings by adding motifs made of clutter. So in some cases they exceed the level of architectural quality seen in Skyrim, and in most other cases they meet that same level of quality. However, it's not evident that there was any vehement emphasis on architecture as compared to the emphasis on visual impact via detailing and other features. I also want to mention that the layouts themselves lean strongly towards loose structure, so you'll notice that much of the presentation and topography is asymmetric and doesn't follow a consistent pattern. Enderal's design style is the best example I've seen in Skyrim of a set of levels that don't follow rigid structure and remain visually aesthetic. And it's actually not as easy to do as you may think, especially for someone that might not be used to that kind of visuospatial creativity. On occasion, you might find something in a design of some sort, for example, that you feel is off due to its asymmetry. So the placement of visual objects on a canvas has to make sense even in an asymmetrical layout, and it's far more of a challenge in that case. Humans like symmetry. When I say like, I mean that they have an innate visual preference for symmetry. Why? Well, one very deeply ingrained reason is that humans have selected against asymmetry over time. That is, they have selected for mates that have symmetry or are more symmetric, which includes facial symmetry, particularly in females selecting for males. Now, one of the reasons for that is asymmetry can be inherently indicative of a health problem or a deficiency, and such a deficiency is indicative of a survival impediment. And so humans and their ancestors have evolved to select mates that survive most effectively. That means that any biologically programmable feature that can be used in selection for survival is of absolute necessity. So that means it's something like symmetry, if it can be encoded somehow biologically, will be encoded and is. Now, one thing to know also is that just because it's possible doesn't mean that essentially all animals will follow that evolutionary route. For example, studies have been done on orangutans where Orangutans did not focus as much on this, on symmetric symbols or symmetric imagery on a canvas as they did other kinds of visual stimuli. So the fact that humans, as compared to orangutans, which branch off in an ancestor of humans' evolution in an evolutionary context, is a curiosity in and of itself. And maybe the difference would also indicate the degree to which symmetry involves the identification of survival capability, especially because it's stronger in the female selection of male partners as opposed to the male selection of female partners. So that doesn't resolve to a precise description of what happens, but it has certainly been shown in scientific research to be of biological depth. And so, for instance, you can use asymmetry to grab someone's attention or use symmetry as the groundwork for an aesthetic visualization. One of the strongest aspects in Enderal is atmosphere. The designer's ability to convey atmosphere at times supersedes the effectiveness demonstrated in Skyrim's capacity to do so. And here I thought it would be a fitting time to elaborate on what makes quality atmosphere. Namely auditory immersion, which falls by the wayside in most mods. Let's roll a previous clip without the visuals and see how much you can feel yourself to be in a certain environment. The whole point being that of the 5 senses, you have 2 of them to stimulate as a designer. Don't restrict yourself to focusing on the visual domain when you have an entire domain available for stimulation. So that's the first key to crafting good atmosphere. You have the visual domain to work with. You also have an entirely different domain that you can work with. Now, the whole point of atmosphere is immersion. So what the aim should be is something like tugging at the mood regulation of the brain. This means playing with mood stimulants like contrast, hue, and sound, and to some degree more related to behavior, although mood surely plays a part, color. And generally, even small children can discern atmospheres on a basic level. I mean, so if you show a kid a grim shack with intense light and macabre sounds, they're probably not going to be happy, or they're going to tell you that it feels scary, let's say, or something like that. If you do the opposite and put them in like a happy land, like one of those kids' TV shows, it will be less likely that they will be in a bad mood. They will tell you how that specific thing makes them feel. It's unlikely that they'll be in a bad mood because of that specific thing. And older people should be able to, of course, give more elaborate descriptions of atmosphere that are intermediate between very rudimentary kinds of mood environments. So colors do have an almost definite effect on humans, although that effect or those effects are not well known with respect to the kind of relationship they have with color. This would generally be seen as a gloomy, dreary environment, for instance, maybe even suspenseful. But the outstanding characteristic of Enderal is that the atmospheres can become incredibly intense and vivid when needed. The Undercity is a perfect example. Everything is downtrodden, melancholic, and emanates a mood of despair. This is conveyed through the slow, grungy music, the intense lighting, and the colors deprived of saturation. The designers also demonstrate their ability to simulate the opposite kind of atmosphere, best shown in Silver Grove, where in the beginning there are bright colors, strong saturation and bloom, a very diverse atmosphere filled with mostly warm colors and highly saturated cold colors. And in that particular case, the atmosphere is really drilled into you because almost immediately after the transition, you get the same environment with the opposite atmosphere, which also serves as a demonstration for distinguishing between environment and atmosphere. Here we have the same environment and two different atmospheres. The colorful one I described. Then once you defeat the mini-boss, everything goes dead. The only thing you really hear is the dismal ebb and flow of the sea onto the beach. The whole scene loses its color. The beach looks dead. The town is basically a ghost town, completely empty, and you only hear the solemn wind in the distance. It's really a display of the mastery of manipulating atmosphere. I want to also comment about this as well, as I alluded to recently, which is the relationship between mood and color. And it's not evident what kind of relationship they have. And the research on this, as far as I know, has been pretty dismal. My suspicion is that any scientific endeavor that seeks to correlate mood to color isn't going to turn up anything scientifically useful unless it's very specific and well-defined behavior that you can link to specific colors. I think research into this topic is also done almost fruitlessly because most of these studies are based on questionnaires or something where environments have too many things that are not controlled for, too many variables that are not controlled for. Also, some findings of these studies have been found to be culture dependent, which is not very useful for designers generally, and in a sense, it's not useful for psychologists either.
Majestic, isn't it?
The second most outstanding aspect is the visual wow factor. There are enough picturesque and grandiose scenes throughout the campaign to remind the player of where they are. So Ark, for instance, isn't just a city on a hill, as it were, but it's a very striking and bold one that reaches to the sky. So you have the same concept, for instance, in a city on the mountain, and you can simply implement that and go no further, or take the extra step and make a larger-than-life image as such. Additionally, there are so many places where the player's attention is grabbed by the amount of detail ingrained in a particular location, in conjunction with the creativity of the imagery in the form of things common to Enderal, such as unusual contraptions and intricate apparatuses, which all tend to be painted with high-intensity lights. Most players will go on their way through a campaign and aren't really the scavenger types that explore every crevice. So if a scene is so visually enticing that it stops the player and they have to stare at it for a few seconds because it's interesting and aesthetic, the designer basically has done their job. As I talked about earlier, the visual creativity is carried out through the creative usage of static meshes and immense detail to make an otherwise regular and conformist scene appear completely new. Enderal specifically has a visual personality of its own that is a maverick among other Skyrim mods because it tends to append visual detail through additional clutter, and this clutter is added to the background of the scene or the buildings themselves, as opposed to being in the corners of rooms or on shelves. So if you compare a dungeon in Skyrim, most clutter is only used to decorate the rooms as opposed to becoming part of the rooms themselves. This technique serves as something that contributes to the visual creativity, as it's not often used for detailing constructs. For the most part, in Enderal, you're playing the same game, but it's a different kind of that type of game. In the same way that you can drive two different cars and they're both cars. I mean that the gameplay doesn't vary so much from Skyrim that it's a totally different type of game to play, but the style of play is, of course, different. Because it's the same type of game, the most interesting events are those where the gameplay strays away into something more creative and different from the norm. Anytime the player has a goal, for instance, such as the rush to escape the Dwemer-style Sky Dungeon, or when they have to fend off invaders, is when the most exciting things happen. And the choreographic and cinematographic manner in which the gameplay unfolds along a timeline undergirds the entertainment. So instead of going to dungeons and getting items and coming back, which is the kind of classic RPG style of play, and sometimes that style of play is even seen in Skyrim quite often, the plot unfolds along with the gameplay. So that means that there are a ton of scenes and unique events that happen which stave off boredom almost completely. The main issue with the gameplay is the combat, which is kind of wonky even after getting used to it. It plays more like an old school classic RPG, and you have to play like a classic RPG player, always attending to updating your gear and stats. The issue is that in spite of that, the level of intensity doesn't really make sense. Wolves, by the way, are basically the most powerful enemy in the game for a while, which kind of proves my point. Additionally, there are times in which you're combating something with an ally, and that can be disinteresting when the ally all but takes over the fight. And since the ally is basically invincible, when the fighting is taken over, the player tends to just sit back and watch, which kind of eliminates the whole point of a challenge. Some boss fights cleverly use an MMORPG style boss encounter cycle to their advantage, where the environment also plays a role in the fight. But some of the mechanics are awkwardly implemented, like the final boss where you can basically randomly explode without being alerted at all, and having no time to react. It's straightforward to move through the campaign, so there isn't any particular place generally where everything slows to a stop and the player is stuck there for an unnecessary amount of time. So overall, in this case, the entertainment sort of keeps on going. Enderal is basically the gold standard for character development in Skyrim. Again, Sure AI outdoes Bethesda almost completely. Skyrim gained notoriety in terms of their characters because essentially, for the most part, if you dig deep enough, you realize that there wasn't much to that character in the first place, and the whole thing seems more artificial at that point. Enderal's characters, most especially the main characters, all have a background and all have personalities, and all have some well-elaborated tie to the plot. When you talk to the characters, they sound human. They don't sound like an NPC in an RPG fantasy that is just there to give you a quest. This is the only mod I know of, sadly enough, where there are 0 issues in terms of voice sound quality. And only one actor which I thought was kind of lackluster and sounded like, in some cases, she was reading off a teleprompter.
In almost exactly the same trouble as in Alderashengrad. Seems I have a knack for that kind of shit.
But for the most part, you can investigate and explore each character's story. This is the whole point of having primary characters there, to bring them to life, as opposed to putting them there to forward the plot event and making them seem like a plastic, artificial doll. There are so many themes and various subplots that I can't really cover all of this content, but the plot is not just a logical plot that rolls out accordingly. It has twists and turns and various nooks and crannies that give it completeness And this ends up being the kind of plot where you want to play the game to see what happens next, as opposed to recognizing that there is a plot, but it's not interesting enough to follow, and shrugging it off to go to the next quest. There are also various themes, many of them aged and some even ancient. The friction between science and religion, and the attempt to reconcile science and religion. Human nature, the contest between the id and superego, pride and humility, and I could go on, and the designers had the guts to get into the gritty details of some of these themes by touching on realities in an implicit way. The Silver Grove subplot comes to mind, for example.
Yes, maybe you're right.
On some occasions, you are even forced to talk with the primary characters, which they cleverly sort of crafted in a way that didn't seem like you were forced to do it. You were forced to participate in a mundane activity. Cases in which there was a scene or some interlude to go to the next level. One perfect example of this would be the train, the subway, where you had to wait until the subway got to its location. There you can talk to Jaspar quite a bit. There was a setup there where the designers basically crafted an entire scene and an entire conversation that, if poorly done, would have resulted in a bored player, but because of the level of quality of the character, the voice acting, the setup of the scene, and the interesting conversation, everything kind of played out to a point where most people were probably at least tolerant of the fact that they had to sit through that. And it was a bold move because most games these days don't attempt to do something like that. All in all, essentially, Enderal is the gold standard for storyline in Skyrim mods, and it is an emblematic example of visual art in level design. Despite the mild issues, it basically lives up to its reputation.
Untouched, as if all that has happened was nothing but a bad dream.